Immediately contesting the center, this pawn's advance opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, influencing the board's dynamism. An immediate challenge to white's central pawn, fostering asymmetric pawn structures and initiating a dynamic fight for space. Immediately contesting central space and preparing development, this knight jump initiates white's thematic struggle against black's Sicilian asymmetry. Bolstering the Sicilian defense's core, this pawn advances, ready to contest central space and prepare for a pawn storm or rapid piece development. Asserting central dominance, this thrust immediately challenges black's pawn chain, opening lines for unleashed piece activity. Opening the c-file for immediate counterplay against white's center, this capture seizes the initiative by trading material for dynamic potential. The knight boldly occupies the center, challenging black's pawn structure and preparing rapid piece development. Developing the knight to f6 challenges white's central pawn and prepares for kingside castling, an active defense against white's aggressive pawn structure. Building a central pawn chain, this prepares for a kingside pawn storm or potential e5 push, though it slightly weakens the king's diagonal. Pushing the pawn creates an immediate central foothold, forcing white's knight to retreat and potentially cramping their development. Preparing for a knightly outpost on c5, this repositioning aims to escape the pawn's immediate threat and survey the central landscape from a slightly more reserved, yet strategically important, square. Black seizes the initiative, aggressively challenging white's central pawn structure and aiming to liberate their pieces. This bold pawn thrust immediately opens lines for black's bishop and queen, creating exciting possibilities while demanding precise calculation from white to avoid falling into a tactical bind. Pressuring the knight on d4 and developing a piece simultaneously, this move aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances on the kingside, potentially targeting the f6 knight. Black bravely challenges the center, solidifying pawn presence and unblocking the dark-squared bishop, which now eyes the kingside. This creates immediate tension, potentially leading to a dynamic middle game where controlling key squares becomes paramount for both players. Sacrificing the bishop in this manner might seem counterintuitive, but it's a calculated maneuver to disrupt black's pawn structure and create potential weaknesses around their king. By forcing the queen to recapture, white aims to gain an advantage in piece activity and prepare for a more aggressive middle game assault. This exchange, though seemingly simple, unlocks strategic possibilities that could prove decisive later on. Opening the kingside pawn structure like this, while potentially creating attacking chances on the weakened king, fundamentally compromises black's pawn shield and creates isolated weaknesses that white can exploit later. The doubled f-pawns offer little in return for the significant positional concession of opening up the monarch to direct attacks. Opening a diagonal for your rook and potentially creating a passed pawn down the c-file, this capture reshapes the pawn structure and forces black to confront the immediate consequences of their king's exposed position. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately re-establishes material equality, but consider the long-term implications. Your king's pawn shield is compromised, and the open g-file now presents a potential avenue for white's pieces to exploit. Think about how this decision impacts piece activity for both sides going forward. Striking the queens from the board now simplifies the position, but by exchanging their queen, black opens the g-file for their rook and significantly weakens their kingside pawn structure. This exchange might seem tempting for white to gain a slight material edge or simplify, but it grants black valuable attacking potential down the newly cleared g-file. Careful maneuvering is crucial now for white to exploit black's exposed king. Regaining the pawn with the bishop immediately addresses the material imbalance, but it creates a slightly awkward pawn structure on the kingside and opens up a clear diagonal for white's remaining bishop. Black's bishop now has some influence, though, and the immediate queens are off the board, leading to a more tactical middle game. This exchange also brings black's pieces into slightly better coordination. This is a clever attempt to disrupt black's bishop structure and gain an advantage in activity. By forcing the bishop to move again, white aims to create a tempo gain and potentially exploit the weakened kingside squares that will arise after gxf6. Observe how the placement of the knight on b3, while seemingly passive, has created this very opportunity by preventing the immediate recaptures that would have maintained black's pawn structure integrity. The ensuing exchange of queens often leads to tactical skirmishes where piece activity becomes paramount, and white is hoping this check will initiate such a sequence favorably. Regaining equilibrium, black solidifies their control over the center and prepares to untangle their pieces, aiming to activate the now liberated c8 bishop to a more influential square, potentially eyeing the queenside development. Developing the bishop to this square prepares to castle kingside and eyes the d5 outpost, which could become a future weakness for black. Fortifying the knight on d7 establishes a solid defensive posture, offering support to the potentially exposed kingside and hinting at a regrouping maneuver to control the central files. Refocusing the knight back to its original square after the exchange, 13. n1d2 now aims to bolster the center and prepare for potential pawn advances, while also getting out of the bishop's firing line on the long diagonal, a subtle repositioning that sacrifices immediate central pressure for greater long-term defensive stability and future offensive options. Probing the queenside for weaknesses, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's developing structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces, forcing a difficult decision on how to respond and perhaps gaining space. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn advances later, this move also subtly discourages black from immediately trying to gain space with a4. Conceding further space on the queenside with this pawn advance might seem passive, but it strategically anchors black's pieces and potentially restricts white's knight maneuvering in the long run, creating a more solid pawn structure that could prove resilient in an endgame. Shifting the knight to the rim, nc1, is a bold repositioning aimed at contesting control of the c-file and potentially finding better square on the queenside, but it concedes significant space and allows black's rook to potentially dominate the d-file later. A bold repositioning of the knight, nc5 eyes the advanced b3 pawn and aims to disrupt white's queenside structure, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. A subtle repositioning aims to exploit the weakened dark squares on the queenside, particularly after black's pawn structure was compromised. Unlocking the g-file offers black exciting attacking prospects, potentially leveraging the rook for swift action against white's somewhat exposed king position, while also preparing to challenge the central pawn majority. Castling the king to the safer side, this maneuver seeks to consolidate white's queenside pressure by activating the rook and tidying up the king's defenses, all while setting the stage for potential pawn advancements on the queenside should black overcommit. Unyielding defense of the kingside takes a peculiar turn here. The rook abandons its potential connection to the queenside pawns for a more direct, albeit exposed, presence on the fifth rank. Reclaiming central influence becomes paramount as white maneuvers the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential advancements, and offering a flexible redeployment for future kingside defense or initiative. Securing the king's escape route with the castling maneuver introduces a dynamic imbalance, as the monarch now retreats to the queenside while the opposing army, despite some pawn weaknesses, maintains a more consolidated central presence and active piece coordination. Shifting the knight to d3 aims to redeploy it towards the kingside, potentially supporting a future g4 pawn push or even a knight sortie to e5, while also vacating the c1 square for the rook. Unleashing the bishop to b5 creates a bold pawn lever, threatening to unravel white's queenside structure with a subsequent a3 push. This maneuver aggressively contests central influence and aims to exploit the potential outpost on c3 should the knight vacate. Creating a queenside bind. This pawn thrust, h4, is an audacious attempt to restrict black's rook on g5 and simultaneously prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, aiming to open lines and exploit the exposed king. It's a subtle yet significant territorial grab, forcing black to consider defensive maneuvers and potentially limiting their counterplay. White is looking to gain space and prepare for future action, possibly even aiming to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure or restrict piece mobility. The rook now ventures onto the exposed king's flank, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and perhaps even create attacking chances down the h-file if white isn't careful about pawn structure. Challenging the rook's secure outpost on h5 creates immediate tension, forcing a decision and potentially opening the king side. Seizing the rook with such boldness, black gambles on opening lines against the now exposed white king, hoping the sacrificed pawn will ignite an irresistible attack. The white king cautiously steps out of the d-file's potential crossfire and seeks refuge on the king side, a necessary precaution given the exposed nature of the g-file and the recent doubling of black's rooks. Reclaiming the dark squares and aiming to activate the bishop within the enemy's camp, this maneuver seeks to disrupt white's imposing pawn structure and potentially initiate exchanges that could ease black's cramped position, while the lurking rook on g8 remains a constant threat to the compromised king side. Shifting the king towards the center, even with the risk of exposing it, is a bold attempt to activate a dormant piece and prepare for potential central action in the middle game. Exploring the open diagonals, the bishop reclaims its influence, potentially eyeing the weakened kingside or preparing to contest the c-file, while simultaneously offering a defensive presence against white's advancing pawns. Unleashing a forcing check across the board, white dramatically interrupts black's burgeoning kingside activity, aiming to disrupt the g5 bishop's comfortable resting place and potentially forcing an awkward repositioning or exchange. A wise repositioning, the king sidesteps immediate diagonal threats, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially find sanctuary on the queen side, while also keeping an eye on the c5 knight's central ambitions. A bold foray into black's territory, this knight seeks to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially disrupt the coordination of black's pieces, aiming to create immediate tactical opportunities or force concessions. Accepting this knight exchange sacrifices a pawn for immediate central influence and clears a path for the rook. Liberating the bishop from its passive post on d3, this recapture finally resolves the tension in the center and offers a glimmer of activity for white's pieces, potentially unlocking lines against black's still awkwardly placed king. Unleashing a pawn storm against the enemy king's sanctuary now opens crucial diagonal lines for your bishop and rook, creating attacking potential that wasn't there moments ago. Unleashing the rook down the open file is a bold attempt to exploit the precariousness of black's king position, aiming to inject immediate chaos where previously only positional pressure existed. The recapture of the rook on h1 is a pivotal moment, immediately opening the h-file for white's king and signaling a shift towards aggressive, open lines, but it also consolidates black's central pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn breaks later. Liberating the rook from its defensive post on the 7th rank opens up the critical h-file, creating immediate pressure on black's king. The pawn grab opens a direct path towards white's king and immediately introduces attacking possibilities, leveraging the exposed black squares around the monarch. Opening up the f-file for your king now exposes it to potential threats, a tactical geometry shift that might prove costly if black's pieces can coordinate effectively. The rook finally finds an active outpost, threatening to disrupt white's slightly passive setup and potentially create counterplay on the open d-file. Shifting the monarch aims to consolidate the weakened kingside and potentially prepare for an endgame skirmish, though it does leave the king somewhat exposed to diagonal threats from black's bishop. Seizing the open c-file offers a potent conduit for attacking the white king's central quarters, potentially creating passed pawns later. The knight elegantly repositions, seeking better diagonals and preparing to challenge the opponent's central influence. Shifting the bishop to attack the knight on c1 opens up lines for your rook and aims to exploit white's somewhat exposed king. Clearing the g-file opens a potent pathway for your rook, aiming to exploit the lingering weaknesses around black's castled king and potentially create threats on the 7th rank. The rook's journey to d4 decisively abandons its partner on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially trap the knight if it's not careful. Pivoting the rook to the 2nd rank now aims to contest the open file and support potential pawn advances down the king side, while also preparing to shuffle the king to a safer square should black's pieces coordinate effectively on the queen side. The rook now seeks to become an active participant on the first rank, eyeing the now exposed white king's position and potentially preparing a maneuver to the c-file if white plays carelessly. Repositioning the knight to d3 aims to solidify the central structure and prepare a potential breakthrough on the king side, while also defending the weak f2 square, which has been exposed by the castling operation. The rook abandons the opened file, potentially surrendering valuable attacking momentum and allowing white to reinforce their central presence with the knight. Prying open the king's defenses becomes a priority as white shifts the knight to a more active square, eyeing squares like g4 and potentially supporting a pawn push, while black's rooks remain somewhat passive despite their central presence. Suddenly, the king finds itself exposed to a potential cannonade along the open file. The rook's journey to the second rank creates a fascinating dual threat. It now eyes the vulnerable pawn on g7 while simultaneously preparing to harass black's king should it venture too far from its castled shelter. This maneuver cleverly exploits white's superior piece activity and the exposed nature of black's king position, hinting at a potential mating attack or a decisive material gain through forcing tactics. This fork, while momentarily disrupting white's setup, forces a swift resolution as the rook now has a precarious perch, begging for a swift counterattack. The king, escaping the immediate skirmish, seeks refuge behind its own pawn wall, a temporary sanctuary from the relentless onslaught of black's newly activated rook and queen. Seeking to disrupt white's rook battery and block the central files, this bishop redirection aims to create immediate counterplay and prevent further encroachment. Opening that diagonal for the rook immediately forces the black king into a desperate flight, creating immediate tactical dangers. King safety has been severely compromised with this retreat, opening the door for a swift and decisive attack down the open file. A strategic retreat to the relatively safer g-file, aiming to reposition the rook behind the king and potentially launch a counterattack or prepare for endgame exchanges, while also denying black's rook access to the decisive 8th rank and preventing any immediate threats against the white monarch. The black rook, having danced across the board, now arrives with a flourish, forcing the white king to retreat from its perceived safety. This aggressive checking maneuver completely disrupts white's coordination and opens up immediate threats. Reactivating the monarch's defensive network becomes the priority, as the black rook now eyes potential infiltration routes towards the king's sanctuary after the recent queen trade. The black bishop, having completed its strategic repositioning, now actively disrupts white's kingside pawn structure and forces the white monarch to abandon its safe harbor. Knight redeployment to d3 aims to challenge the suddenly active bishop on b5 and potentially exploit the newly opened diagonal. The bishop's retreat to e3 offers a welcome respite, aiming to regroup and potentially reroute towards the kingside assault that white has been meticulously building. It avoids immediate confrontation, allowing black to survey the evolving landscape and consider new avenues of counterplay now that the immediate threats have been parried. Bishop's repositioning from g4 to f5 initiates a dangerous diagonal scan towards black's now exposed kingside, potentially setting up a decisive battery with the rook on h2 should the opportunity arise.